All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked, and we are stoked that you're joining us this Friday live on YouTube. And yes, we have a third this week. Last week you joined us, and it was Phil and I. And we were stoked to continue that conversation about into the margins and what does that look like. And this week we're excited to have a new wine leader, pastor, and just a crazy good guy who leads so much and teaches. I mean, Phil and I'm just always amazed when we sit down with Pastor Jim, and we're stoked that he's joining us this Friday. Now, we're talking about discovering the good news, and New Wine is all about stepping into engagement of culture from a Christ-centered, spirit-led truth. And in talking to Jim's a pastor, and their congregation, their church association, their church body has just gone through a process of basically looking back into the history of their church and then how it engages culture. And it was this process of discovery. And sometimes discovery sounds great, doctrine of discovery. And before even I knew what Pastor Jim was talking about, I was like, oh, discovery, just doctrine of discovery. That's cool that your church is going through this. And then he sits down and starts talking to me and filling us in about, the history and the background of just his church and the Covenant Church. And it's enlightening. And today as we're talking about discovering the good news, it's so we have to be mindful as Christians that sometimes when we talk about good, what we're doing is not promoting the good for all, even though we think what we're doing is good. And so in this discovery doctrine, it sounds great. Discovering things is good. Eureka, I found something. But not so much when it comes to the goodness of all people. And so Pastor Jim, thanks for joining us. We're stoked. Jim's a New Wine leader. So for any of you who's ever been involved with New Wine, you know that you've seen Jim on the table talks, or you've actually worked with him, Portland, Washington area. And so we're stoked to have Jim on here today. But tell us a little bit about Jim. Thanks again for joining us. But what is discovery of doctrine? It sounds neat, discovery doctrine. Wow. But when you start talking about it, not so neat.
Not so neat. Yeah. Great to be with you. Good seeing you, Phil. And Matt, it's always a blessing to be with you guys. It's just fun. It's just fun to just kind of hang with you guys and chill. And so I was really worried about, because these guys are like, educated. They're like academia. Me, I'm just kind of like stumbling around and like wanting to tell stories. But Matt assured me that, hey, this is like jazz. And I love jazz. It's just kind of the flow of things. And so, I think that's probably why you get along so well. So thanks for having me on. My name is Jim Sequeira. I live in Vancouver, Washington, which is just across the river from Portland, right across the river from Phil. We get together often, so it's good to see you on screen, Phil. And then I just want to recognize, because part of the Doctrine of Discovery is just recognizing that the Native Americans, the people that were here, prior to all the discoveries and all those kind of things were here long before us. And so I always like to recognize the Chinook people. The Chinook people, the tribe has lived in this area, the land that I am on now, it's their land, for 10,000 years. And one thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting, because when we talk about land, we talk about ownership of land, whereas Native American and Indigenous people, when they talk about land, it's more of stewardship, taking care of the Creator's creation. And so, I want to be real careful with that, because everybody thinks, oh yeah, they just want their land back, but it's just really kind of the response, they just want to be able to fulfill the responsibility the Creator's given them. And so want to recognize the Chinook people. If you ever, wherever you are, recognize this, figure out, discover and find who are the people that were there and honor them by just reminding us of their name. So the Doctrine of Discovery, yeah, you said the Doctrine of Discovery. We call it the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. And so what it was back in the mid 1400s, it was a papal bull decree. It was a decree by the church that in essence said, if you go to a land and it doesn't look like it's inhabited by Christians, then you can take it. Then you can take the people, and you can take the land. In essence, you're able to plant the national flag, your country's flag, and also the Christian flag. And so that was the impetus behind. And there's a whole lot more to the Doctrine of Discovery than simply that. But in essence, what it boils down to is just the Doctrine of Discovery says that not everybody is created in the image of God. And so, like Matt was alluding to, when we started talking about he sent me a text and he says, hey, the topic's going to be the gospel. And is it good news, or is there good news? And I'm torn because, for me, as following Jesus, I experienced the good news. But when we learn about, in fact, learning about my own Hawaiian history, but the history of others, the history of Africans and Native Americans, I mean, the gospel isn't necessarily good news. And so this doctrine of discovery, our denomination voted, and we talked about repudiation, is to basically say, we condemn this. We condemn this doctrine. We condemn what was behind it. And let's move forward. Let's learn from this, but let's just work towards, again, reconciliation. Let's share a gospel that we can all live into and call good, right? And I know that there's a lot to it, but there's a clip that, Matt, if you can go ahead and show that clip, it gives you, and what this clip is, let me just set it up, is that prior to our annual meeting, which was a couple weeks ago, we showed this for the year. We're trying to just educate people because not a lot of people understand what the Doctrine of Discovery is. So this is just a 3-minute clip explaining what the Doctrine of Discovery is. And so go ahead, Matt.
All right, awesome. Here we go.
If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. This June, at the Evangelical Covenant Church annual meeting, delegates will have the opportunity to vote on a resolution to repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery can be traced back to the 15th century, when popes began issuing a series of decrees that established religious and legal justification to colonize and take ownership of land that wasn't currently occupied by Christians. In 1823, in a unanimous decision for the U.S. Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that, quote, "The principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands," unquote. Thus, the Doctrine of Discovery became part of U.S. federal law, legalizing the dispossession of Native people from their land.
This became a significant part of the story of the lands of these nations. It is a part of the story of the people who were here long before the United States or Canada was even an idea. In fact, it is a dehumanizing story. That its beginnings can be traced to papal decrees means the church had a direct hand in launching this belief and practice. For that reason alone, it serves us well to shine light on this history, to not only remember, but as fellow ambassadors of Jesus, who has given us the ministry of reconciliation, to renounce such evil.
The sin of the Doctrine of Discovery is the determination that the full expression of the image of God is found only in certain races.
As a denomination, we recognize and include Indigenous people in our purposeful narrative. As a church, we have become more aware of the multi-generational impact of poverty, hopelessness, loss of identity, loss of life, and suicide on Indigenous people and people of color as a result of the Doctrine of Discovery.
It is time for us to recognize the hurtful past of the Doctrine of Discovery and to repudiate it. We're asking the church to listen to our stories and hear how this resolution can start the healing to our brothers and sisters.
When you hear that I was born on Pine Ridge Reservation, you might understand this means I'm Lakota, but what do you understand about reservations? Why were they created? Did you learn about the Doctrine of Discovery in school? What it is, what impact it's had, and how it continues to harm Indigenous peoples today? Are you willing to consider what role the church has played and what a healing response might be? We may think that this is all history, but it's not. It continues to affect us all.
Ecclesiastes reminds us that 3 strands cannot be broken. When one hurts, we all hurt. The Doctrine of Discovery separates the strands of the body of Christ from each other, elevating the rights of people of European descent above Indigenous people as well as other people of color. This hurts us as a church. But this year, we have the opportunity to make a difference. A written resolution to repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery will be presented for a vote at the 2021 annual meeting. Please take time to get informed. Visit covchurch.org/resolutions to learn more.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and so kind of the result of the annual meeting. So we presented the paper, and then there's an open discussion, and there's, of course, people wanting to vote against it. And so so we're hearing from both sides. But the bottom, in the final ending of it all, our denomination voted 84%. 84% of the people voted to repudiate it, to condemn this. And so, I literally broke down in tears, because it really is a big step, and I think in the right direction for our denomination. So,
Yeah. So was it, has this come up before for the denomination? Like, hey, let's discuss this. Let's dialogue about this. Like, what spawned this right now?
Yeah, I would say, personally, what I believe is that the woman that you saw, Lenore 3 Stars, so she's a good friend, but we do this thing called Journey to Mosaic, where we travel around the Northwest and visit areas of racial injustice. So we hear the Asian American stories about the Japanese being put in the concentration camps, the Chinese Exclusion Act. We go to Portland, actually. Phil has been part of this. We talk about the African American story in Portland. Just the gentrification and all those things. And so basically it's a story. We hear people's stories just to hear the other side of the story. And so Lenore shared her story with the Lakotas, and she shared about the Doctrine of Discovery. And this was, probably, 12 years ago. And it was the first time I heard about the Doctrine of Discovery. And the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then it wasn't until like the second time I thought, wow, there is something to this. And then in kind of looking more into it, it really did affect also the Hawaiian Islands. And then back in 2017, we have what's called a Midwinter Conference, where the pastors and ministers gather together for additional teaching, and really just to kind of reconnect. And so at that time, we were invited to share about the Doctrine of Discovery, Lenore and myself, and also Curtis Ivanov, who's the superintendent of the Alaska Conference. And so as we were preparing, there was just a lot of indications of the things that were going on that night and where we were located for the discussion, that Lenore and I got down there, started putting chairs away, because we were figuring maybe, we were hoping for like 20 people. But that evening we had over 200 people sitting in and listening to the Doctrine of Discovery. And a majority of them, if not all of them, literally would say, I did not know this story. And so that really kind of got the ball rolling. The Christian Action Committee, decided to present this repudiation as an action step for Love, Mercy, Do Justice. And so it's been in process since 2017. And so we were really happy this year. We weren't sure, just because of COVID and all these things that were happening. Some people were saying, well, let's wait on this, but we really felt, let's just present it. We had some momentum. There was some articles in our one of our publications that came out that talked about it. So we just really felt that this was the time, and it worked out. And so that's kind of the story. But and there's I think four other denominations that have also repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. But it's interesting, because people don't, they just don't know the story.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jim. So a couple of things. First off, I went to Journey Mosaic probably 3-4 years ago, and after going to it, I think every Christian that lives in the Pacific Northwest should go. It was 4 days essentially of backpacking through the area, or kind of just a bus tour, kind of just going through different sites and hearing different people's stories, and it was just amazing. The whole time was just amazing. So definitely that, and just congratulations on the statement being made by the denomination. This is a big thing for you. I want to say I remember back in 2017 when you started these conversations up, and
yeah,
it's amazing that all these years here we are. Yeah. So it's pretty cool. So now, thinking of the Doctrine of Discovery and what the Evangelical Covenant Church did to take a look back and put together a statement like this, do you think either within the ECC or other denominations, not just Doctrine of Discovery, but are there other things that we should be looking back at and the church should be making a concrete statement saying, this is something we're not going to do this, or this is something we stand against from our history?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I'm sure there is and are. I think, at least with the Doctrine of Discovery, is that it really does affect a lot of people. I mean, and I think sometimes, I have a friend, I was talking to him last night when he, do you remember Dale Vallejo Sanderson? He's the pastor in Hawaii, Oahu. And I remember when Dale visited us, we started talking about, they were interested to including their church from Hawaii to be part of the Covenant Church. And so Dale asked me, he says, does the Covenant Church recognize the complexity of multi-ethnicity, right? Or being multi-ethnic? And I'm like, oh yeah, we get it. We understand, because, and I think the Covenant has come, is farther ahead than a lot of people in the discussions and things like that. But I remember Dale he says, and so after I said that, Dale says, I mean, like complexity such as who has a voice, when you have multi-ethnic people, because leadership is shown or value is shown, and when you have people's voices up front. So is the Covenant ready to have different voices and different people up front? And that's the complexity of multi-ethnicity. And so like when you bring that up, Phil, there's so many voices, right? And I think, we do want to hear, the many voices. But I think sometimes, at least, what touches your heart? What are you involved in? And hopefully, how does that make a broader, bigger impact? And so I think one of the important pieces of the Doctrine of Discovery for me was just how it affected my family personally, or my peoples, if you will, but also the land that we're on, right? I mean, we go to different mission fields to share the gospel. We'll get back to the gospel, but you know what? I mean, this is a mission field for what we've done for Native Americans, and the gospel has not gone well, for them. And so for me, I think, you're right. There are so many things I think that we can get on and discuss, but I think it's really educating. But what I like about the Doctrine of Discovery, or why I think it's so important, is because it does impact everybody, right? And I think it also, the ramifications is that who is created in the image of God. And so that talks about a lot of people groups. And so that's, so for myself, it's this question about who is, who can be described as being in the image of God.
Yeah, we when we started over a year ago with Uncorked, one of the first things that Phil and I jumped into is image of God. And it's such a discussion, though, that I think so often is just glossed over by Christians, that when we start talking about our differences, we don't start by saying how, regardless of who the person is in front of us, according to the Christian doctrine, all people are created in this image.
Yeah. And I think, Matt, the other thing too, is that even the term, I mean, how do you define gospel? What is the gospel, right? And so, I'll say this, the missionaries, whoever, the people that carried the Doctrine of Discovery, their intent was good. They wanted to take the gospel to the Hawaiian Islands. They want to take the gospel, they brought the gospel here, but I mean, it's a totally different gospel. When we look and we see what the gospel is that, it might be that, salvation, through the death, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it's that salvation. But for Indigenous people, that's not enough. It becomes, well, and it's still alive today. Well, you know what? Now you can't play your music, you can't use your language. I mean, part of the plan for the Doctrine of Discovery in the United States was the residential school. And General Pratt, and the residential school was basically to assimilate Native Americans to become Christians or Americans, right? Because Christians and Americans are the same thing. And so basically Pratt's kind of the motto was kill the Indian and save the man. And so that was the intent. And so, so that all of a sudden the gospel is not just, believe in Jesus and the resurrection and you shall be saved. It's like, okay, now that you're saved, You need to look like us, dress like us, and because we're in the image of God.
Yeah, because it's like the saving was almost, we need to save you from yourself so that you can then become more like us. And so, and I see this, we've had some discussions on within the church, like with some church leaders, like the Driscoll and his kind of followers, where I would go to weddings and they would take that where the female would thank the male, you know, for allowing basically her to be created in his image. And then, you know, and then through the man, then there's a recognition and an ability for the female to come to the Father or this Godhead. And even today, like when people hear probably even our discussion today about this discovery of doctrine of discovery, how, wait, they're not Christians who still think this way, right? I mean, but isn't that the thing, is like, sometimes I think the Christians think that the good news is that we're saving you from yourself so as to become more like me, as opposed to, oh, well, covenant is because of Jesus Christ. And so if we're going to look to any human, it's the one who is fully God and fully human. And for some reason, that's a difficult concept for a lot of Christians.
Yeah. You know, and you bring up a great point, because, you know, especially the attack on the Capitol, right? You know, I mean, I wrestle with this because my sense is that they got a big pass. And a lot of the reason why this thing got a pass is because, oh, they're Christians. Look, they've got flags, they're singing, you know, what is it? Our God reigns. I mean, I'm just like, really? You know? And so it's almost like, you know, oh yeah, they're created in my image, so they must be in the image of God. Whereas, you know, oh, look at Matt, the guy's got tats on his arm. You know, that is not the image of God. I mean, I don't know if you've ever felt that. I mean, or people have, you know, just kind of thought before they have that discussion with you, or before they really get to know you, there's kind of that sense like, you know, I mean, there's a lot of things that go on in people's heads with that, right?
Don't you think that I know when I was talking with some folks about just Hawaii and how like Hawaii has trying to press the gospel into the Hawaiian culture. And one of the comments was, oh, wait, can Hawaiians be Christian? You know, like that idea that, wait, aren't they a different culture? Like as if Christian is synonymous with white America.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
One of my best friend, who's Hawaiian, I don't know if you ever heard it, is Kamaka Bivola. He's the guy that sang like Over the Rainbow. And so Wald is his first cousin, but Wald, I remember, I mean, his story is he grew up in Planada. He says that he was raised by Hawaiians, wolves, and Mexicans, right? And so he grew up in Planada, but his deal was when the pastor prayed with him and he asked, you know, became a follower of Jesus, the pastor literally told him, he says this, you're not Hawaiian, you're Christian now. Right? I mean, that, you know, just that mentality of being able to, you know, you're not this, but now you're a Christian.
So Jim, in your church, how in your church do you guys kind of celebrate the multicultural, the diversity of different cultures in your church? How is your church broken down? Just those kind of things. How do you celebrate that?
Yeah, you know, I think part of it is, I indoctrinate them with the Hawaiian language, right? I mean, our invocation is aloha. You know, we talk about ohana. You know, part of it is just allowing, culturally to be able to share culturally, you know, who I am. And people love that. I mean, people grasp onto that because, you know, but I think, you know, having people just sharing a voice and hearing people's stories and just seeing the, you know, interaction. And so it's a challenge. I mean, and we're, you know, Philip, I mean, you know, we're a long ways from really being considered a multi-ethnic church. I mean, we do have various ethnicities and it comes and goes. And I'm surprised we're a smaller church when people come in and go, man, I can't believe the diversity you have in your church. I mean, and some of these people are coming from larger churches in Vancouver when they visit us in the past. I'm like thinking, we are so far away from this. And so, but Sister Velma, I think is one of those people that that have helped our church in the past. Sister Velma is African-American. I mean, she's like Pentecostal, right? I mean, she comes to our church and she visited us once and then kind of stepped away and then came back, but went through the membership class, became a member of our church. In fact, years ago, went on Journey to Mosaic a couple times. But this is the heart of people I think is really important. Sister Velma says, Pastor Jim, you know that the music and the way I worship is totally different that I'm used to. And sometimes it's really, really hard. But she says this, I'm thinking that there's not a lot of people that know African American Black people, and I want them to know good Black people, right? And and so I think it's just part of it is people willing. I think from and I know it's a challenge and it gets to be painful, but I just really love the heart of Sister Velma. I mean, it's people like Sister Velma that puts herself in this position, dying to herself, in order that people to be representative to at least people having a good experience of people that are different than they, giving people an opportunity to love their neighbors. And so I think, I think that's part of the challenge is giving a voice. But also I find it really challenging because one time, so my culture, especially Indigenous people, older people, you don't call them by their first names. And so I had, so soon, Auntie Soon is Korean, so I call her Auntie Soon. I call her Sister Velma, and so I call certain people aunties and uncles. And so one time I was talking about, hey Auntie Soon, she was in the congregation. Hey Auntie Soon, remember this? And started talking about that. And Sister Velma raises her hand and she says, in my culture, that's very offensive calling somebody an aunt, right? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm like, really? And so I journeyed to Mosaic, Phil, and you might have been at the table with us, but I asked my Black brothers and sisters, I'm like, okay, so here's what happened. And I explained to them, and most of them are like, no, I've never really heard that. You're on your own, bro. But later on, I heard from somebody who grew up in the South, and the reason why she said that they find it disrespectful is because people used to call, the white folks used to call other white folk like Missy this and Missy that, right? Mr. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so, Missy this. But because they didn't call them Miss this or Miss that or Mrs. this or Mr. that, it was almost as if calling them uncle or auntie was a step below, right? And not, and so I thought, wow. And so, I think that's the beauty of multi-ethnicities, because I am always learning. Phil teaches me. And so, and I think just being able to have brothers and sisters to go to and say, hey, you know what? Help me out with this. Where did I go wrong? So, but I think the richness of the church, it's a challenge. And it really, I believe, is a call from God. I think it's a call, not only as a pastor, but as a congregation, because multi-ethnicity is very, very difficult. And it's not simply saying, hey, you know what? We have a Hawaiian worshiping with us, really. So my question is, hey, do you know some, are you guys singing Hawaiian songs, or, what are you doing to include them in being multi-ethnic? And so.
Yeah, I think this idea, I think we need to dialogue even further to what multi-ethnic, like what does a diverse church look like? Because so many people would think, oh, you could walk into a church and as long as you see different shades, then it's diverse. The problem is that you could have people who all look the same and think the same. You can have the same, you can have a church where you walk in and everyone looks differently and yet they're still thinking the same. You can walk into a church, they all look the same, but they think differently and they're thinking diversely, and so I think even before we start talking, because look, back in the day, there was a book called The Purpose-Driven Church, by Rick Warren. And I didn't agree with a lot of, I don't agree with, Rick Warren's got a theology that sometimes I don't agree with a lot of it. One of the things he said in the book that at first I was like, dude, what are you talking about? He says that a diverse church, it has to be spirit-led. And he was talking about like how most churches aren't going to be diverse because it's too difficult and multi-ethnic. He didn't press into it further enough, because what he was saying in some sense is true, but he wasn't saying it the reason why he was saying it. He was making it seem like diversity is too difficult, so we don't even try it. It's got to be a spirit-led thing. Well, of that statement, yes, it is very difficult. Yes, it's got to be spirit-led, but yes, this is what God calls us to, that the diversity is not something that we shy away from, but I think we shy away from it because we don't even know what it means. When I think the folks like on January 6th is what a lot of people in the church hear when they hear diversity. They think, oh, you're coming into my church and you're going to change it to where then people who I consider as sinners, in the list of sinners, whether it's gay, whether it's trans, whether it's gambling or some sort of addiction, alcohol. When I hear diversity, what I hear is you telling me that those people those people. Remember, Phil, last week we talked about this topic. But those people coming in and being okay to come into my church now and take over leadership and do everything. And so I think a lot of people hear diversity as a means to opening up the doors and just, trashing all doctrine, trashing all, because we have to be liberal in our love. And liberality and love means that you can't have any, strongholds or doctrines. And I think that's because we just don't know diversity.
Yeah. So Phil, I've got a question for you, because I know that, maybe it was before you got to the Covenant Church prior, but I remember the conversation about diversity, right? Or multi-ethnicity and inclusion and all this. When you start to, when that is preached from the pulpit, especially of people of color, there's kind of a kickback. And I've heard people even say, we are tired of hearing about racial reconciliation. We just want to hear the gospel. Right? I mean, how do you respond to that? I mean, when people say this, there's a separation between the gospel, and maybe it's because, white folk are kind of getting uncomfortable hearing about it so much. But I mean, is that been your experience too? I mean, have you heard those comments that we're tired of racial reconciliation. We're tired of justice. We want to hear the gospel. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Fortunately, the circles I've been in are circles that they're questioning and trying to understand, what does it mean to be multicultural? What does it mean to include the other? And I've been fortunate to be more recently a part of those kind of conversations. The conversations that I haven't really been, that I'm looking forward to participating more in, is amongst Black brothers and sisters. Like, what does it mean now to, will we accept the invitation? What would that look like to be included? Because the trust factor is still a problem, because it's not as if attempts towards reconciliation, towards racial reconciliation within the church, it's not that these questions are new. These things have happened before, and power has been abused before, and things have been manipulated before. Come along and send your choir, don't preach the sermon, sing a song, those kind of thing, dance for us, kind of thing. Those have been the experience. And so now we're going to have a different conversation. How do we know the conversation is going to be different? Yeah. So that becomes probably the more powerful conversation now, because most of the vanilla brothers and sisters I'm around, we have questions and we're dialoguing and the like. But when my Black brothers and sisters, hey, it's, we've been down this road before, and we know what this looks like. So yeah.
Because Phil, like, this is I would imagine. I mean, I'm curious just with your studies. That's why I just so enjoy talking to you about what you're finding out in your studies. But wouldn't you say, and way more about the Black history, the history of the Black church in Portland, but this idea that kind of, I think, was behind gentrification, is that the white church brought in the Black church. They said, ooh, look what we can do together. We can help clean up our area. And then in the process, they almost, the Black church was completely, washed over, in the sense of, hey, we're bringing you in for relationship, but it's not really, we're just trying to get you to agree with what we want, because what we want to do is clean up this area for us. And so the church did it under good news. This is the gospel. We're fellowshipping, ohana, right? The family idea, but it wasn't family. It was like, oh, well, we need you next to us, so everyone else agrees with us, so that the Black community is okay for us going into the inner city and cleaning it up. But the cleaning up just meant, oh, well, people that look like you are going to be pushed out, because they didn't take care of, it's one thing to clean up a city, but it's another thing to truly clean up the structural evils that are oppressing that city. And I feel like that's what happened in Portland, is this idea of cleanup only meant cleaning up the unwanted, the unsightly that we think is tearing down our city. And so I imagine that in the history of what you're finding with the churches, this talk of reconciliation is, as both of you said, this is not new. The question is there, though, a newness of the people talking that actually believe in what is being said, or are we just, waxing eloquent, and all the white people are just going, oh yeah, this is a great idea, because it makes us feel good.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of things with Portland, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was the movement of the church in relation to gentrification. Because think about it, in early 1900s, those that were Black churches in Portland were in downtown Portland.
Yeah.
And as the downtown area expanded is where those places were pushed out. So for instance, Mount Olivet's second building is right near the Moda Center, Memorial Coliseum. And the Ku Klux Klan gave them a donation of the lumber to put the building there because they wanted them on a better side of the town, right? So as the city expanded, and it wasn't necessarily that it was the church that was in support or necessarily against that movement. The church, the bigger churches, so the bigger American Baptist Church and the like, gave money, gave those kind of things for those churches to get established where they got established because those Black churches needed money. So they were able to help them get there. So it wasn't necessarily that the church was for or against it, but that was maybe some of the problem because you didn't have a big brother that was at the table having a part of the conversation. You were in a vulnerable position to be able to get moved back and moved out of town. That ironic thing. So take a church like Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church, who's been there for quite some time. They got a donation to build the building that they're in now, and they've been there for a long time. And it was their big brother that helped them get there, and they've stayed there. So you did have help from the church from the bigger brother church to help get those churches settled, but it wasn't necessarily the church's involvement or lack of involvement that it left them vulnerable. It left the Black churches vulnerable, so they moved several times to get into the places that they are. So.
Phil, so do you think, because it just seems like, at least for the story for African Americans, it's always kind of this displacement, right? And so you have what is it? What was the city in Vancouver?
Vanport.
You have Vanport, yeah. Right? And so now you bring in all these people to work, the shipyards, African Americans work the shipyards, they're bringing them in, but it's kind of like, well, let's just keep them down there by the river, right? Let's keep them away from Portland. Vanport floods. And so people start to migrate up north, and it's kind of like they come into the North Portland area, and you described all those churches, and it's as if they're saying, let's just try to keep them here. It's almost kind of like, because the churches have played a significant role in displaced people's lives. And so, there's kind of this sense like, well, let's just kind of let's try to keep them in this area. But then also you see that, oh, wait, they're beginning to kind of spread out a little bit. We better redline. We better start redlining and keep them out of these neighborhoods, right? And so then, all of a sudden people are realizing, hey, these are kind of good neighborhoods, and then the gentrification thing starts happening, and then now a majority are displaced, in Gresham and things like that. But it's just kind of this, this movement of displacing people, right?
Absolutely. There's always been Portland's history has always been bound to that. And so, yeah, you have the weird thing about it is any community that you've had, any neighborhood that you've had, the bulk of African Americans in Portland, that percentage has never been the dominant percentage in any particular neighborhood. So albeit, we're all in the northeast, north Portland area, we still weren't over 50% of the population in this area. And so now, as we're even moving back more over the past 15, 20 years or thereabouts, it's still kind of just same kind of thing. But at the same token, you still have just economic progression and people that's able to move to the suburbs. You have people that are, employees for Intel and Nike, so they're moving into Beaverton and the West Side areas and the like. So you definitely will have those things, but you do have just a separation of people. The most vulnerable get shuffled and moved more and more around, and those who are affluent can just get into those other neighborhoods. That's always been kind of a story of Portland.
Yeah, so it's interesting too, the displacement, because we talk about this with the Gospels in the sense of if the Imago Dei is true, then the idea of displacement should never come with people. It should always be a thing, and that thing should be sin, and sin should be the thing that's displaced. But instead, what we do, and this is what the Russian writer Dostoevsky uses with the Grand Inquisitor, says that the Grand Inquisitor is irritated because Jesus, the person representing Jesus, wants to give people more than just breadcrumbs. And so often the church is just giving breadcrumbs. We just give breadcrumbs. We just invite people in enough so that they agree with us, that they don't stop what our pushing is, what we want. And that means that the majority leadership of the church continues to give morsels to the outskirts. And in the evangelical church, that tends to be people of color that are on the outskirts that are just giving these morsels, these crumbs, And so this push, the fact that you guys were willing to wrestle with the doctrine of discovery and to acknowledge, okay, at first there could have been, the intentions here might have been, well placed. However, as days go on, we need to continue to wrestle with our doctrines of the church. Nothing is absolute. The only thing that should be absolute within the Christian church is this Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit, right? They're our doctrines, though, we still have to recognize that they still are created by us. God is leading us, but we need to be discerning. So I think it's courageous to continue to have these dialogues. And hopefully you guys are interacting with other denominations and saying, hey, what about your doctrines?
Yeah. Yeah. We, talking about, the whole mission field, right? When we take the gospel into a certain mission field, for some people, the gospel isn't good news. For some people, it is good news. But, even theologically, Matt, you bring up a good point, because you know what? I think there's a lot of assumptions, right? That when we say gospel, we all understand the same thing. When we see, the word evangelical, sometimes I'll say, we're part of the Evangelical Covenant Church, but that is not our political stance because it has been, hijacked. But even when you say evangelical, you have to qualify. As a person that, we say we're, the heritage was evangelion, it was good news, but we have to qualify to say, we're not that, and so I think, even in our discussions, maybe theology, theological doctrinal discussions, we have to see it as a mission field. We need to sit and understand, what is the other person? I think one of my sayings I love to share is to say it's easier to impose than to understand, right? Understanding, sharing stories, it takes a while. Getting to know people takes a while. It's easy for me to look at your arms and make an assumption. It's easier for me to impose what I think about you. But if I sit down and have a conversation with you, that is going to be totally different.
Absolutely.
And so, maybe so, as we have discussions theologically, we need to understand, when people say that they're non-denominational, they believe in something that makes them a denomination, right? They might not have the secret handshake or the magic ring and all that kind of stuff, but there's something about them that, and so even though they say they're non-denominational, that doesn't say anything to me. It's kind of like, well, infant baptism. No, we don't believe in that. Okay. So you're Baptist, but there's some, but there's some DNA about denominations and doctrines. And so I think, it's important to flush it out. I think that's why I love New Wines, because for me, what was confusing is, what are we about? For when I came on the advisory board, I'm like, what are we doing? What are you guys doing? And I would talk to different people like Jody, what is this about? And so she would kind of give these descriptions, and then I'd start asking, what? No, it's not that. But what I've learned is that, and I think, Phil, you brought this up as far as, what are the important, what are important things that the church needs to, to look at. What I love about New Wines and having conversations like this, for me, it has broadened my perspective. I have learned so much about, I didn't know very much about, disabilities. I have a heart for it, and you're compassionate, but listening to Trudy and understanding disabilities, that has broadened my perspective. And I think that, at least for me, although that might not be the thing I push, I do get involved because Trudy matters to me. She's our sister in Christ. And so we get involved. And so I think the beauty of, for me, is the diversity and the breadth. And it's not just one topic, right? It's not just one thing to say, hey, we need to push this. And that's what was confusing with me, right? Why are we having discussions with Mormons and all these other people, right? But it's, that's the kingdom of God. It's about understanding. It's about hearing stories. And so I think opportunities like this is important because it broadens our perspective and our understanding, which allows us, I think, to engage better, right, in theological discussions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, that's exactly what New Wine is all about. Engagement. It comes from active, and it's just a bunch of getting together, figuring out, okay, well, there's this dude named Jesus who comes into our lives. So the question is where are we going? And the question, and that starts the question then of who am I, right? And Jesus is the question that he asks all of us is, well, who do you say I am, right? And so by answering who we say Jesus is, we're saying who we are. And this is all about what New Wine is pressing into. And so we're stoked that Pastor Jim was able to join us today, and he's going to join us on and off throughout, just like everyone will continue to bring in guests, as Tony's doing, because he's doing his thing with the church right now, which is what we all want, is for us to press into the ways in which we can participate with what we're stoked that you took time out today to join the three of us for our discussion, which is an ongoing discussion. Pastor Jim was saying, the good news is not good news for everyone. So why? If we have a God who was good and is good, the great good, the great I am, yesterday, today, and forever, tomorrow, shouldn't that news of goodness be the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow? And so why is it not? So we're going to continue this discussion, but we're stoked and we're thankful for Pastor Jim and his input today and his interactions. And like he was saying, this is what New Wine is all about. It's stepping into those arenas, those situations, those areas that we might be uncomfortable with, we might be unknowing, or we have a passion for, because we want to engage one another, to hear each other's stories, because that's what life is all about, the interacting stories, the interweaving stories, to come to realize, wow, you're a lot like me, and we're all in need. And so we're stoked. So thanks for joining us today, Pastor Jim. So awesome. It's been just a blessing. It's just a great, like you were saying, just coming to know each other in a 1 hour time, how life-giving it can be when we sit down with someone else other than ourselves, right? I mean, an hour conversation in the mirror could be life-giving, but stuff like this right here is truly life-giving. And this is what New Wine wants to continue to push and encourage each other. Someone that you don't know, ask questions, ask about who they are, because you know what, when you understand someone else, you're going to understand yourself further. And that's what this network of relationship, Ohana, the family of God. And so we're thankful. We hope that you have an awesome weekend. If you want to know more about New Wine, go right there in the comment section right there on our YouTube page, watch Pastor Jim, and to give you more information if you want to join. And if you have any other comments or questions, put your questions in there, and then we can put ways for you to get involved if you want to do the journey of Mosaic, and ways to know more about the history of the Portland church or the Vancouver church. Contact New Wine, and we would love to partner with you, because this is what it's, coming to know the person in front of us is coming to know the world around us. And so thanks again for joining us here, New Wine UnCorked. I'm Matt, that's Phil, that's Pastor Jim, and we're stoked that you joined us this morning. Until next week, we'll see you on the flip side.